Hello, ladies and gentlemen. In this episode of our app development series, we're going to make a custom UI component that allows us to change the date that we're currently using to view the games. So as you can see here, we have the list of games for a particular date, but we have currently hard-coded that date in. And what I want to do is add a little calendar up at the top that allows us to switch the date that we're currently viewing. So before I start on that, I wanted to make a small adjustment to our code. I'm going to import the activity indicator from React Native. And what I want to do is add an activity indicator here to let us know when we're loading rather than seeing just a blank screen. So to my state, I'm going to add a new property called isLoading, and I'm going to default that to false. And then I'm going to make a function here called getGamesForDay. And this is where we're going to move our game loading code. Whenever this is called, we're going to set the state of isLoading equal to true, because once we called that, we know we're going to initiate loading the games. Then we're going to call the API here to get the games. And instead of having the date hard-coded now, we can actually grab the year, month, and day from our date object. So I'm going to make variables for that. I'll say year equals this.state.date.get full year. Month equals this.state.date.get month. And day equals this.state.date.get date. And then I will swap out the calls to this function to be year, month, and day. And now, in addition to setting the game's state variable, I'm also going to set isLoading equal to false. Because once we've reached this point, we have finished the loading. Okay, now I can delete this out of our constructor, and instead we can call this.getGamesForDay. And let's just save and refresh to make sure that everything's still working. Looks like we are getting a warning here. It says, cannot call setState on a component that is not yet mounted. So the reason we're doing that is because we're calling this in the constructor, and when we should actually be calling it is in the component didMount lifecycle method. So I'll change that. So now it will wait for the component to mount before trying to get the data. So I'll save and refresh. And as you can see, it took a bit of time for the data to load, and it would be nice if we saw an activity indicator so we knew that it was actually loading and it didn't just freeze or something. So we're going to use the isLoading state variable now, and we're going to render an activity indicator if we're currently loading. So up here at the top of my render function, I'm going to say if this.state.isLoading, then we're going to return an activity indicator with an animating property equal to true. You could also set the animating property equal to this.state.isLoading, but we're only doing this when it's true anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And end the activity indicator. Now if we save and refresh, hopefully we will get an activity indicator. And I saw it just briefly. It's a bit small and it's all the way up at the top of the screen, so I'm going to give it a style. First I'm going to set size equal to large, and then I'll set the style and I'll give it a padding top of, let's say, 40. So it has a little bit of space between the top of the screen and where it actually shows up. So save one more time and load, and you can see it just briefly. And one thing, if you want to just test out how it looks, an easy way to do it is to just reverse the logic here. So now I'll say if not this.state.isLoading, in other words, if it's false, then we'll show the activity indicator. So now we can see how it looks, and I think it looks pretty good, so I'm going to stick with that. Okay, so now I'm ready to begin working on the calendar component that we're going to create. So I'm going to go into my components directory, and I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'll call it app. And that's just where I'm going to put my custom components, because the project template already came with a few of them and I don't want to get those mixed up. So I'm going to put all of my components in the components/app directory. And a good idea to always do in your components is to go ahead and create an index.js file. We'll use this a little bit later, but this makes it easier for us to import components. Now, what I want the calendar to look like is basically just a small bar up at the top of the screen that has the date that we're currently looking at somewhere in the middle, and then it has arrows to the left and to the right that will let us go forward and backwards in time. So I'm going to call that component DateBar. So I'll create a new file in my app folder and I'll call it, datebar.js. And we'll go ahead and do some boilerplate here. So import React from React. Let's import view and text from React Native. And I think for the arrows, we're going to need some icons. So let's import material community icons as icon from React Native vector icons. And then we will export a default class DateBar, which extends a React.component. And we'll probably need some styles, so I'll also import the style sheet, and we'll go ahead and create a const styles equals style sheet.create. Okay, and every component is required to have a render method, so let's create our render method, and for now we will just return some text that says DateBar so we can display it and make sure that it's working. So I'll save that, and then I'll jump into the index.js file, and here's where we can export all of our components from the index file, and then we don't actually need to reference the individual files. So we can say export default as DateBar from DateBar, the file. Okay, so we should be good to go, and if you noticed, the app is always loading to the test screen, and it's more convenient to while we're doing development, I'm going to put the DateBar on the test screen first, because every time I refresh, it goes to that screen, and that's a lot faster than having to refresh and then flip over to this screen and make sure I like it and then make adjustments and so on. So I'm going to do everything on my test screen, and when I'm happy with it, I'm going to move it over to the actual games screen. So I'll open up my test screen file, and now we can import the DateBar. So we can import DateBar from, we need to go up one level because we're in the screens folder, and then into components/app. Let's save that and make sure that the import worked correctly. And right below test screen, we will display a DateBar component. So if I refresh, we should see the text DateBar. Perfect. All right, so in the DateBar component, let's think about what kind of properties we want to pass into the DateBar. I think we'd like to pass in a date that we want to start off with. So I'm going to create a static default props object, and I'll say date, and the default value will be today's date. Just like that. And we also would like to have some events that we can subscribe to, basically the date changed event, and we'll probably say, and maybe even left arrow pressed and right arrow pressed or something like that. So let's make a function here on date change. That's a function that takes a date. And I'm only putting that here as a default because if someone tries to use the DateBar component and they forget to pass in a function and we try to call that function, then it will crash if there's no default. So that's the reason I always put defaults for all of my properties. All right, in the render function, we're going to make this a little bit more complex now. So let's return a view. And in that view, we're going to have a left arrow, a right arrow, and a date label. So to get the left arrow, let's search for the icon set that we're using, which is the material community icons. So I'm going to come to the GitHub page and click Material Community Icons. And I'll search for the name of the icon. It's usually a chevron type of arrow that I like. So I want to use this for left and this for right. And it's just chevron dash left and chevron dash right. So back over here, I will create an icon with the name equal to chevron left. And let's create a style for it. It'll be styles.icon. And down in our styles, we'll create an icon style. Copy and paste that and change this to chevron right. And then in the center, we'll add a text here that has the date. But let's just make it say date for now. Okay, so there's our component, and you see that they are stacking vertically rather than horizontally. So let's give a style to our outside view. So we'll say style equals styles.container. And to make them stack horizontally rather than vertically, we need to set our flex direction equal to row. Let's also give it a flex 1. Okay, so it's looking better. We just need now to center the date and keep the arrows on the far left and the far right. In order to get the arrows on the far left and the far right and the date in the center, we can add a justify content to our container and set its value to space between. And we'll refresh and see how that looks. Great, so we have the arrows on the left and right, the date in the center. Now let's update our icons a little bit. Let's make the size a little bit larger. So we'll set size equal to, I don't know, we'll try 30. And actually we can't use size there. Let's do font size. Okay, that looks like a good size. You could also use a size property on the icon itself, but I think it's a little bit easier to use it in the styles. All right, and let's change the color to be gray. And instead of date now, we want to actually display the date as a string. So let's jump over to the date reference page on Mozilla, and I'll search for string and see if there's a way, if they have some sort of function for converting it to a string. So I see here there's toDate string, so I'll click on that and see how that looks. Okay, it looks like it will show us the day, and then the month, day, and year as well. So why don't we try that? So instead of writing date here, we'll add this.props.date.toDate string. And we can go ahead and add a style here. We'll say styles.date in case we want to add some styles to that. All right, everything's looking good so far. We'll need to adjust this text just a little bit. Maybe we'll add some padding on the top of about 5, see if that adds it. And then we also want to make these icons clickable. So to make them clickable, let's import touchable opacity from React Native. And let's surround our icons with a touchable opacity. And every touchable opacity needs an onPress event. So let's say onPress equals this.onLeftArrowPress. And for this one, we'll say onPress equals this.onRightArrowPress. Then we will implement those functions on left arrow press and on right arrow press. Save and refresh and make sure as we click the arrows, we see we get the opacity change here. And now what we want to do is update our date. However, since the date is a property rather than a state variable, we can't actually update it. So we need to add a constructor here. Don't forget to call super props. And then we want to create a state where we have a date equal to the date of the property. So the date will start off as this.props.date. And now we want to reference our state variable in our UI rather than the props variable. So let's say here this dot state dot date, and we'll save and refresh and make sure everything's looking good. Okay, now let's implement the on left arrow and on right arrow press events. So what we need to do is increment or decrement the day of our this.state.date anytime the arrow is pressed. So the way we can do that is we will create a variable called new date, and we'll set that equal to a new date who has the starting value of this.state.date. And then we will say new date.setDate, and we'll get the current date here, and then a -1 for the left arrow because we want to go back one day. And then we will set the state, so we'll say this dot set state. We'll set date equal to new date. Let's save and make sure that works. Now when I click the left arrow, you can see I'm going to May 25th, 24th, 23rd, 22nd, and so on. And we should have basically the same idea for the right arrow, except we're going to add one instead of subtract one. So I'll save. While that's loading, I'm going to add some comments here. Now let's test the left and right arrows. So this one's going May 27th, 28th, 29th, so on. Let's see what happens when we get to the next month. Perfect. So this appears to be working pretty well. And the last thing I want to do for this component is notify any users of the component if the date has changed. So we're going to call the onDateChange function. So in each of these, I'm going to say this.props.onDateChange, and I'm going to pass in the new date variable. Now, one thing that's important is you should not do this.state.date, because the state may not have actually updated. Even though you called set state, it doesn't update synchronously. So it's possible if you did this that you wouldn't be sending the correct date. So make sure to send new date. And then the same thing here, I'll just copy and paste that to save a little bit of typing. One final thing we should add to our component is the static getDerivedStateFromProps function. So I'm going to add a static getDerivedStateFromProps, which takes the next props and the previous state as inputs. And this function is actually a replacement of the component will receive props function, which is being deprecated soon. And what it does is it figures out whenever the props change on your component, and it allows you to update the internal state of the component accordingly. So since we have passed in the date as a property, we need to figure out if the date property is changed by a user of this component and update our state version of date. So the way we do that is we return an object, which will be the new state, and we're going to set our date equal to nextprops.date. And I think we're good to go. So now we have a nice date bar here. We may want to add some borders or something a little bit later, but for now this appears to be working pretty well. Okay, so now we're ready to move this date bar over into our game screen. So I'm going to jump into the game screen here, and we're going to import date bar from components/app. And now in our render method, let me add a comment here. If loading display activity indicator. And now in here, we're going to put the date bar right above our flat list. So we'll say date bar, and we have the onDateChange property. So we'll say this.onDateChange, which is a function that we'll implement in just a second. And we have the date property, which we have in our state here as this.state.date. So this.state.date. And let's save and refresh. And I'm going to go ahead and delete the date bar out of my test screen since we're done with it there. Okay, so we can see here we have our game screen, and it looks like the date bar is taking up a lot of vertical space, a lot more than we'd like it to. So that may be because of the flex1 property right there. Let's test that out. Okay, yeah, so we shouldn't have had flex1. It was causing it to take up a lot more space than was necessary. Okay, now we need to implement the onDateChange function for our DateBar. So I'm going to add that right here. Remember, it gives us the new date. And what we want to do here is this.setState. We want to set the state of our date to the date that's given. And we also need to reload our games for that date. So in that case, we will call this.getGamesForDay. And this should set the new games for us. It'll also set the isLoading equal to true. So let's save that and see if it works. All right, so we're on May 24th. This looks like the schedule for May 24th. If I go back a day, we see it's loading briefly, and I'll have to double check on the internet or something to make sure that these games are correct. But for now, let's just assume that this is the actual schedule for May 23rd. I can go back. There's May 22nd, go back forward, so on. Okay. So now we have a nice DateBar component. We may make some slight visual tweaks to it in the future, but for now I'm kind of happy with how this works, and it allows us to switch between dates very conveniently. So thanks for watching the video.